Here on Origins, we've covered many turbulent tales of successful games, franchises, and characters whose darkest days have come before the dawn. However, the larger-than-life title character that is Duke Nukem doesn't quite fit this mold. His franchise, which started strong and established a popular cult following, eventually became synonymous with one of the most infamous pieces of vaporware in history. Sit yourself down, viewer, as we take you through this story of tragedy and obsession that begins, rather ironically, just after the golden age of video games.
It may be the most addictive toy in history.
Became 1,000 miles just for this game?
I've done 7 stores a day for 3 weeks now.
We have literally over 100 different characters, people, animals, wizards, spells.
Video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world.
Extraordinary demand for the product has drawn worldwide media attention.
The year is 1986, and in Texas, a young Scott Miller has made one of the biggest decisions of his life to date, choosing to drop out of Dallas University. Scott was a bright kid and had a love of video game design which he felt was being restricted rather than encouraged during his pursuit of a higher education. Moving back in with his parents, who thought they would now be stuck with him until his 40s, Scott was determined to prove them wrong and create entertaining games that captured audiences everywhere. At the time, IBM computers, with their Microsoft Disk operating systems, or MS-DOS for short, were the world's most popular choice at the time, and were the go-to for many gamers and developers alike. In his first year back home, Scott designed 2 well-structured text adventure games, but with no experience or contacts in the industry, he was short on distribution options. His hand was forced, and he uploaded the full games to an online bulletin board system that gave players free access to his work, with only an optional donation to help fund Scott's work in return. Unsurprisingly, people took this for granted, and Scott's donation-based income for the year was under $10,000, not quite enough for him to consider moving out of his parents' house just yet. Knowing that he wasn't going to get anywhere with this current model, Scott sought a new strategy for the release of his upcoming third title, Kingdom of Kroz, a dungeon-crawling game with vibrant colors, 60 levels, and countless hours invested into its development from Scott alone. To implement his new sales strategy, Scott founded Apogee Software in 1987 and brainstormed a new business model, which he dubbed the Apogee model. Instead of uploading the full game for free, Scott uploaded the first few levels of Kroz for players to try out. Once they'd reached the end of this stretch of the game, Apogee Software's contact details appeared for players to order the full game. Think of it as a free sample stand at the supermarket, enticing you in to buy the full product. It was a bold move, but one that paid off dramatically. The game generated close to $100,000, giving Scott some much-needed breathing room in his development process. Having been working at a local arcade at the same time, Scott had become friendly with another aspiring game developer who also worked there, George Broussard. Off the back of Apogee Software's first success, Scott asked George to leave their arcade jobs and join him in designing games, using the Apogee model for distribution. George eagerly came on board, and together they began work on new titles. At the same time, Scott opened up Apogee's revenue streams to become a third-party distributor. There were many early developers out there who'd been in the same position as Scott and were struggling to secure effective distribution of their games. One in particular was Todd Replogle, who brought his first few games to the hands of Apogee. They helped Todd market his games, taking a small percentage of the profits. The three found common likenesses in their work and agreed to take their professional relationship further. Apogee welcomed Replogle on board, and the dynamic duo became 3, and they were eager to take the next step in their developing saga. With the help of a few outside designers and programmers, the trio got to work on a new platform game. Rather than start completely from scratch, the team did what a lot of other small dev groups were doing, and modified code from other games on the market. As a third-party distributor, it wasn't difficult for them to get their hands on an array of titles to work off of. Platform games had become second nature to the group, and the genre as a whole had become a little stale. The majority of games now were regurgitating the same graphics and animations, with limited tech making it difficult for anyone to set themselves apart. unless you were a Nintendo-sized company with a Mario-sized franchise to suit. The only differences for the smaller firms like Apogee came in the structural design of levels or the artwork of the game, which led to a low level of replayability. Apogee had spotted one niche though that hadn't been exploited yet: comedy. Don't get any ideas now. This wasn't going to be some platformer crossed with Saturday Night Live, but they wanted to create a game so outlandish that they gave the genre a renewed sense of joy. And at the heart of this would have to be a character to match. George put forward an idea of a macho man type, being a combination of John Wayne, Clint Eastwood,
Alive or dead, it's your choice.
and Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Come with me if you want to live.
Nodding heads liked this idea, and before long, they had their title character. Enter Duke Nukem. Duke was an all-guns-blazing, self-loving meathead hired by the CIA to defeat Dr. Proton, a mad scientist hell-bent on taking over Earth. Duke, in his own words, was the hero of every man and the dream of every woman. And crucially, he was the only operative capable of taking down the tyrannical scientist. The storyline really ended there, as Duke possessed only two skills: an innate ability to use any firearm he was equipped with, and an ego that could seemingly act as a shield. Duke was not immune to the graphic and code-sharing nature of the platform genre, and the Ray-Ban-wearing brute found his gaming world heavily influenced by other platformers, mainly Turrican and Mega Man. However, the guys at Apogee were never going to get away with making a game that just stole from its rivals. With that, they designed their environment so everything from enemy tech bots to chicken drumsticks could be shot at, destroyed, or in the case of the drumsticks, fried, just how the Duke likes them. Summer 1991 saw Duke's first public appearance as Apogee released the game using their tried and tested shareware model. Their intentions were for it to be simply another step and another title in their back pocket, earning them a quick buck before moving on to their next project. And at first, it fit this description to a T. Considerations for a second game were practically non-existent, with Duke Nukem already similar to a lot of other titles on the market. To produce a sequel would have been seen as half-hearted in an already lazy genre. But the game was beginning to prove popular, and after somewhere between 60 and 70,000 copies had sold, Apogee was starting to rethink their decision to gloss over any chance of a sequel. The income from the title allowed Apogee to double down their efforts as both an in-house producer and third-party publisher, attracting new startups to approach them for representation. One such company was id Software, who Apogee helped to launch their soon-to-be hit title, Wolfenstein 3D, propelling id further ahead of themselves in the development circuit. Apogee had established themselves as the go-to publisher and one of the most consistent developers in the platformer genre.
This year, Apogee, which sells software, and id, which creates it, will gross close to $5 million, up from $6,000 2 years ago. 31-year-old Scott Miller and 29-year-old George Broussard, who own Apogee, discovered a breakthrough in marketing computer games. They sell directly to the public, but first they give away part of the games they sell through a service called shareware.
We take a larger game and break it into several smaller parts, and we put the first part out in shareware so that people can try it and see if they like it. And if they do, they can order the rest of them back through us.
What they lacked was their own mega hit, and this prompted them to revisit their ego-hardened, danger-loving muscle man. Apogee were ready for Duke's return to platforming action, and Scott, George, and Todd were keen to add more to their character's personality, alongside a slightly more interesting storyline. The game began with Duke launching his new book, aptly named Why I'm So Great, on a talk show, before he's abducted by aliens who plan to use his brain to orchestrate their attack on Earth. But they should have known better, as Duke breaks free and faces off against them with an extravagant arsenal of weapons, including flamethrowers, rocket launchers, and laser guns. It was an absurd action platformer with a plot that could only be described as bizarre. In other words, the perfect follow-up to Duke's first adventure. The self-proclaimed Adonis also received a graphics upgrade, as well as an update to his gameplay, which allowed aimed shooting rather than just fixed horizontal firing. With much anticipation for Duke's return, Apogee released Duke Nukem 2 in 1993. But even with all these updates and upgrades, Apogee, without realizing, had released their game just a week before id Software dropped their newest title, Doom.
Welcome to the world of Doom, a hellish nightmare for the more real, the more intense world of Genesis 32X.
id had enjoyed massive success off the back of Wolfenstein 3D and had been able to publish Doom off their own backs, without the assistance of Apogee. Doom was an exciting first-person shooter, a genre that was just in its infancy in comparison to the tiresome platformer, and with both games available for the MS-DOS, players voted with their wallets. Doom sold millions of copies, while Duke Nukem 2 couldn't crack 100,000. Apogee was still in profit from their title, but this was a lesson to them that they needed to switch up their approach if they wanted to stay in the game. Apogee began a major rebrand. They created separate sub-brands for each genre of games that they designed to tighten up their focus, but many of these genres, like the platformer, were beginning to die out, and Apogee soon found themselves focusing on one singular brand, 3D Realms, which covered, yep, you guessed it, their new 3D games. Leaving their old name in the dust, Apogee rebranded themselves fully to 3D Realms, in an effort to follow id Software's massive commercial success, with Wolfenstein and Doom racking up some of the biggest numbers the industry had ever seen. But Scott, George and Todd hadn't made any 3D games themselves, so wanted to start with something that they and their audiences were familiar with. There was only one man for the job, and he just defeated an alien race, wearing Ray-Bans and a vest. Duke was about to get the greatest update he'd ever seen. Find out more after this break. Following the success of his shareware Apogee distribution model, Scott Miller had teamed up with George Broussard and Todd Replogle to design and publish their own games. Duke Nukem had been their greatest success so far, but with rapid progress in technology and a shift to 3D gaming, their expertise in 2D platformers was becoming outdated, and they made the switch to the three-dimensional world under new company name 3D Realms. With no experience in designing 3D games between them, the trio and their now small team of programmers found themselves studying the genre's frontrunners, id Software. They used Doom as their foundation to build their own first-person shooter for Duke Nukem to operate in. George and Scott noticed that a lot of the current titles in this area of gaming were putting players in unrealistic settings, so strived to put their own steroid-infused action man in far more normal locations like streets, bars, tower blocks, and prisons. They also wanted to give Duke the full comedy effect that they'd wrestled with over the first two titles, but one crucial aspect had been missing. He didn't speak. Looking to correct this, they employed local radio presenter John St. John to voice their overly confident title character. John spent many hours in the recording booth, supplying 3D Realms with countless lines for Duke to deliver in the game, the majority of which were usually about how awesome he was.
I've got balls of steel. I've said that 1,000,000 times now. I think that was 1,000,001 actually. But it never gets old, I love it!
Duke Nukem 3D was finalized in early 1996, and the shareware version of the game went on sale at the end of January that year, with the full game released in April. It was one of the most hotly anticipated games of the year, with 50,000 copies on pre-order for the April launch. When players finally got their hands on Duke's first steps into 3D gaming, the franchise, to use a term that Duke would approve of, blew up. But this was only the beginning. An announcement from 3D Realms was coming that was about to change the perception and cultural significance of Duke Nukem forever. Duke Nukem was enjoying his extended time in the sun, and 3D Realms were delighted with their early venture into 3D gaming. George Broussard had become the main game director at 3D Realms by this point, with company CEO Scott Miller heading up the majority of the financials. Both Broussard and Miller, along with legions of fans, were keen to see where they could take Duke next. April 27th, 1997 was the date when George Broussard announced that Duke Nukem Forever was going to be the fourth installment in the franchise and would be released in just over a year. 90s technology was developing at a meteoric rate, and the game engine that 3D Realms had used for Duke Nukem 3D just a year prior was already vastly outdated. Rather than build their own engine, the folks at 3D Realms licensed id Software's Quake 2 game engine for $500,000. Strangely though, id hadn't actually finished building the Quake 2 game engine themselves, and instead gave 3D Realms the original Quake engine while they finished off the newer model. This should have been the first alarm bell for the Duke Nukem makers, but instead they accepted it, intending to fill in the gaps when the new engine was ready. Progress was going well through 1997, and in August of that year, just a few months after George had made the announcement of the game, the first screenshots were released in PC Gamer magazine and on their website. By the end of the year, id Software had finished their Quake 2 game engine and handed it over to 3D Realms. At the 1998 E3 conference, George Broussard stood proudly on stage as he showed off the first trailer for Duke Nukem Forever, whipping the crowd into a frenzy who barely cared about the month or so delay the game might face. That brief month or so delay soon began to loom heavily though, as the development team struggled for weeks on end to render the different environments in the game. One programmer suggested they switch to Epic Games' new Unreal Engine, but George flicked this idea away with his hand, insisting they'd get it right at some point. But they didn't, and some months later, in the summer of 1998, Duke Nukem Forever was still on the operating table, with environment rendering still proving the top concern. Finally, the head honchos acknowledged what they needed to do. In June that year, they finally made the leap to the Unreal Engine, which meant almost a complete reboot on the project. These delays were furthered by George and Scott's constant urge to add elements to the game which kept up with the very latest technology. They built a motion capture lab to generate more realistic movements for their characters, amongst many other details that were constantly being improved upon. But as soon as they finished updating one part of the game, another upgrade was available somewhere else. 3D Realms weren't inventing their own tech, they were just trying to hang on to the coattails of everyone else in the industry. Development on almost every other game at the company had halted, and it was all hands on deck to press on with Duke Nukem Forever, which was now being mocked publicly despite 3D's continuous hype over the game. And then, early into the new millennium, 3D Realms offered up a lifeline. At the 2001 E3 conference, 3D Realms dropped a new trailer with exhilarating action and gorgeous graphics, which began a frenzy all over again. George announced the game would ship out for Christmas that year, and it quickly went to the top of many gamers' wishlists. The dev team was sure that George would follow through on his promise this time, but history has a funny way of repeating itself. Broussard continued to get bogged down in what other games were doing and forgot about his revised Christmas launch date. In fact, another 2 years passed without the game even offering a demo to its fans. The extensive grind on development was taking its toll on the workforce too, and the once company-wide project had now shrunk to just 18 developers. It was in limbo, and whenever any developer was asked when the game would be released, they would all respond with when it's done, as instructed to by George. This took them as far as 2003. Away from 3D Realms, GT Interactive, who'd been waiting patiently to market and distribute Duke Nukem Forever, were bought out by Take-Two Interactive, the makers of Grand Theft Auto. Take-Two were a lot less polite about 3D Realms' incredibly delayed project, with CEO Jeffrey Lapin making a public announcement that the game would not be out that year, and his company would be writing off nearly $6 million from its earnings due to the game's extensive delays. Broussard didn't take kindly to this public attack and hit back viciously with an expletive-filled rant that did little to help their cause. Lapin was right though, as 2003 came to a close and Duke Nukem Forever was still kept behind closed doors. 3D Realms had reached yet another point where they'd taken so long to make the game that the technology available had modernized once again, and in 2004 they switched out their entire game physics engine for one built by a very unknown Swedish design company called Mekon. The year was spent working this into the coding of the game, and the company went radio silent for the entirety of it, saying the public would get a glimpse at the E3 event in 2005. But we know 3D Realms too well by this point. 2005's E3 conference came and went, without an appearance from George, Scott, or Duke. A decade on a single project was burning out even the most resilient of the dev team. To no surprise, even the most dedicated employees started dropping out and moving on. This was a wake-up call to George. He began sourcing new developers, being transparent with the current state of the project, and, seemingly for the first time ever, became serious about finishing the game. By December 2007, a brand new trailer was released, and news outlets began reporting an unofficial release date for the end of 2008. Things were looking up, and Duke Nukem Forever looked set to finally get its moment in the spotlight at E3 2008. 3D Realms never showed up, and Duke Nukem Forever failed to appear on shelves or online that year. It was yet another missed release date, although surprisingly, the project was nearing completion. 3D Realms were missing just one key ingredient: money. The entire project so far had been funded off of the profits from Duke Nukem 3D, but the game, released in 1996, was now ceasing to sell any copies some 13 years later. It was a race against time for Scott and George, who hopped on a jet to visit Jeffrey Lappin at Take-Two Interactive. They showed Jeffrey what they had and asked for $6 million to complete the game by the end of the year. They didn't get the money. George and Scott were forced to do what had once seemed unfathomable. They suspended development on Duke Nukem Forever. $20 million had gone into the game's development, and now 3D Realms had no option but to pack it in. Take-Two had no interest in completing the game themselves, and it looked like Duke Nukem was over. But for those programmers with a profit-sharing incentive, there was still reason to complete the game, and a small group of 8 or 9 of them did exactly that from their own homes. They appealed to Gearbox Software's CEO, Randy Pitchford, who was once a developer on Duke Nukem 3D, and asked him to help finish the game. To their luck, he agreed. The character couldn't die like this, and pledged his support in Duke's time of need. The magical day that seemed like it would never come finally did on June 10th, 2011. Duke Nukem Forever was completed and released worldwide after a nearly 15-year wait. In all honesty though, they probably shouldn't have bothered. With original design starting back in 1996, the game was outdated and clunky. Duke Nukem's selling point was its absurd humor and over-the-top action. But the world had evolved a lot over 15 years, both in attitude and technologically. Yet Duke Nukem had only paid attention to the latter, and the foundation of the game was stuck in 1996. There were some suggestions in 2015 that the series might get a reboot, with Randy Pitchford revealing Gearbox had begun early concept work on a new game for the series. But all Gearbox have released since was an updated 20th anniversary game of the franchise's greatest title, Duke Nukem 3D. Since then, the franchise has remained dormant, and, potentially for the best, it seems as if it's finally run its course. From the heights of inventing a brand new distribution model to the lows of nearly 15 years in development hell, the young guys at Apogee Entertainment could never have foreseen the legacy their muscular main man would leave behind. A once popular title, now left with the Guinness World Record for the longest development time for a video game in history. And even after that, the game was a critical disaster. Duke has probably fried his last chicken drumstick and shot his final alien, but as for 3D Realms, the company is still going strong today, with Scott Miller still at the forefront of operations. As for George Broussard, let's just say he's currently working on his own personal development, out of the spotlight and far away from 3D Realms. This has been Origins, and we'll see you next time.
It may be the most addictive toy in history.
It became 1,000 miles just for this game?
I've done 7 stores a day for 3 weeks now.
We have literally over 100 different characters, people, animals, wizards, spells.
Video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world too.
Extraordinary demand for the product has drawn worldwide media attention.